Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT video. Today we'll be doing an end of set 4 review. We'll be looking at the systems introduced in both the original set and 4.5. Beyond that, there's mechanics to talk about, items, and of course, champions and traits. With so much to cover, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. While there's a lot to talk about in regards to set 4, the main mechanic we're going to start off with is Chosen. Chosen, oh boy, Chosen. Chosen has been a controversial set mechanic that the majority of players ended up disliking by the end of the set. Originally, it was very well received because it seemed like the mechanic promoted flexible play. As time went on and players got better at the set, it quickly became apparent that the Chosen system had the opposite effect. Of course, the mechanic did have inherent flexibility, especially later on in set 4.5 when they increased the odds of finding a Chosen if you didn't have one. But the issue was that with a Chosen champion, you automatically got a 2-star version of the unit with increased stats. On top of that, you got 2 of a trait. This means the player would know exactly what they were going to play just from one unit alone. Basically, the Chosen system ended up holding the player's hand and taking away the necessity of making a lot of choices. Yes, you still needed to put together a cohesive board, but if you hit, say, Olaf as a Chosen, well, you're sure running Slayer and maybe even Dragon Soul. There's less choices to be made, and thus, flexible play wasn't as much of a necessity. All that aside, the Chosen mechanic did have its highlights. Hitting the Chosen you were looking for felt good, and it did make the game overall easier for lower-ranked players. Players also felt rewarded for making pivots based on what Chosen they found. Though the skill expression of doing so was less than in previous sets, it still felt rewarding to do so. All in all, we could honestly do a whole video dissecting the Chosen mechanic, but we'll leave it here by saying that there were positive aspects of the mechanic that players enjoyed, but at the end, a majority of players leaned towards disliking it more than enjoying it. Now, let's move on and talk about quite a few of the systems introduced within set 4 as a whole. Up first is a not new system, more so about the changes they made to the existing leveling system. More specifically, we're talking about the experience changes. They tweaked quite a few systems at the beginning of set 4, but the largest system change they ended up making and sticking with was the experience requirement of leveling from 7 to 8 and 8 to 9. Level 7 was also affected, but it wasn't as noticeable of a change as the other two. Going from level 7 to level 8 wasn't too massive of an increase, but enough that level 8 was harder to hit than previous sets. That plus the level 7 experience increase meant hitting fast level 8 by 4-3 was no longer viable unless you sacrificed economy or were massively high rolling. Hitting level 8 later wasn't too much of an issue, but it does tie into the level 9 change. That change was the massive increase in experience required from level 8 to level 9. It went from around 66 experience to 80. That is a huge increase. And we saw how it affected the whole set with level 9 never being that easily hit. It did make sense for the Chosen mechanic, as otherwise players could potentially rush 9 and hit a Chosen 5 cost. But it did make level 9 hard to get for most players in a lobby. We'll have to see how this plays out in future sets and whether or not they end up reverting this increase. Let's talk about a few new systems introduced into the mid-set update 4.5. Lucky Lantern was added in 4.5 and was all around well received. The fact that every player received the same contents from the Lucky Lantern when it dropped in their game made it feel fair and balanced while also providing more choices for the players. The new consumables felt good, particularly Magnetic Remover, which allowed you to pop off items from a unit. The main controversial issue with Lucky Lantern was the loaded dice. Giving a shop roll for specific units was great, but it came at the price of players hitting 3-star champions far too frequently, which was already an issue of the set. Loaded dice aside, the Lucky Lantern was a great new mechanic and one we'd love to see added again in future sets. The other mechanic added in set 4.5 was artifacts. Orn arrived and brought a whole bunch of new items called artifacts that he alone could make for you. They had powerful effects that for the most part felt fair and balanced. Items are a very important part of TFT, so having the ability to add new items to your board in the late game was great. Overall, artifacts were a well-done mechanic and one that players universally liked. We have one last system to talk about for set 4, which is really not a system. Instead, it's a nod to the increase in B patches that they did throughout set 4, whether it was to hotfix something or to tweak balance slightly. The increased frequency of B patches made the game feel a lot smoother in terms of balance, as any egregiously overpowered champions or traits got necessary nerfs midway through a patch. Hopefully we see them continue this in Set 5, as smaller incremental balancing felt all around better than major patch after major patch. With that, we've covered the systems of Set 4. Let's move on and talk about a few specific mechanics that Set 4 had, starting with 3-star champions. Because of the chosen mechanic, shop changes, and eventually the introduction of the loaded dice consumable, we saw a ton of 3-star champions hit in Set 4. 3-star champions in a bubble are fine. They should be obtainable and provide a potential win condition. The problem with Set 4 as a whole was 3-starring a champion was far too easily, especially for 4-cost units. It took away the feeling of 3-star champions being special and difficult to hit. Instead, it left the meta in a spot where hitting a 3-star champion was almost a requirement for certain builds to win. Playing against 3-star champions over and over again was, quite frankly, just not that fun. At the end of the day, this is an issue specific to Set 4 because of the chosen mechanic, so it's unlikely to happen in future sets. Another mechanic we saw was the increased amount of crowd control in Set 4. Crowd control in any form is healthy for the game, but Set 4 had a lot of crowd control, and we don't just mean stuns. There were attack speed slows from multiple sources, including Adept and Ezreal. Dazzler and later Morgana would lower the attack damage of enemy units. There were disarms, mana increasing effects, huge slows, and sleeps. And of course, plenty of stuns and displacements. The sheer amount of crowd control within Set 4 made positioning awkward at times and limited the way you could itemize certain champions. Of course, not all the crowd control was problematic. Sejuani, for example, did have a large AoE stun, but being a frontline, it felt good having her in the game. Adept, on the other hand, was a bit too good by affecting the whole enemy board with an attack speed slow, which didn't feel fun to play against. All in all, it's a fine line that developers have to walk with CC. Not enough, and it feels like there's a lack of options in the game to make interesting decisions with. Too much, and you end up with something like Set 4, where going against all that crowd control feels oppressive. Set 4 definitely showcased the extreme side of crowd control, which has been important for them to tune future sets properly. Alright, let's shift over and talk about items. We've already discussed a few items like artifacts and the Lucky Lantern consumables. Instead of focusing on those items or any specific item, let's instead focus on item flexibility. Item flexibility is always a hot topic for TNT, and in Set 4, we saw both ends of the spectrum. The first half of the set felt, for the most part, well balanced in terms of what items were usable. The second half, though, there was definitely less flexibility because the carries of the set required specific items. This led to players forcing items and builds, whereas the first set we saw a lot more flexibility in what players were running because the items were a bit more open. A lot of these issues came down to the champions. The first half of the set we had a lot of options you could carry with, such as Jhin or Riven. Set 4.5 though, the carries were less flexible, and on top of that, the items required for them were very specific. Like Kayle, for example, needed bows to do well, whereas Jhin could be given a wide assortment of different items and still be fine. This also meant slamming early items, a common tactic for playing your strongest board, was far less effective in 4.5 than it was in the first half of Set 4. Overall, players are likely to remember how items felt in 4.5 more than the first half of the set because it was a worse experience. But a good thing came out of it, which was a lesson that having a lot of viable items is healthy for the game, and this is represented well in Set 5 with the Shadow item mechanic. Our last section of the Set 4 review is a quick look at champions and traits. Starting off with the original Set 4, we saw a fair amount of diversity. The meta, for the most part, favored flexible play, which was represented by specific champions and traits. Most notably was Jhin and Dusk. Jhin was, all around, one of the best carries of the set because he fit so well into so many comps. He also did well as a 1-star champion if you had items for him. This meant you could play a lot of different builds without relying on hitting a specific chosen if you were able to play Jhin as the carry. Dusk was similar in that the trait provided so much flexibility to your board you could easily pair it with multiple different traits. Riven served well as a frontline or a carry, Thresh brought survivability to the board, and Vayne did well in the early game as an item holder. And of course, Cassiopeia, a mystic with crowd control. More specifically, the trait itself was universally good because it boosted the ability power of your whole board. Despite the chosen mechanic reducing overall flexibility, Set 4 did have a lot of useful splash traits. Adept was the best with Shen in the front line and Yone for the late game, but the attack speed slow mattered the most. Mystic, of course, continued to be useful. Then there was also Spirit for an attack speed boost, though it had a few rough moments in the meta thanks to Shade and Zed. And in 4.5, there was Siphoner, which provided a way for your board to heal. Unfortunately, the diversity of Set 4 is a bit tainted by the lack of diversity in 4.5. Yes, there were plenty of splash traits and you could easily mix and match a lot of traits together, but a lot of the meta was controlled by a few traits and champions. The obvious one, of course, was Slayer. The issue with Slayer is that you had two viable 4-cost carries, Olaf and Tryndamere, that you could easily pivot into because of the chosen mechanic. Then in the late game, there was the option for Samira, who was easily the most influential 5-cost of the whole set. On top of that, the trait itself was an easy damage boost and only required 3, or 2 if you had it chosen, champions, which meant you could add in all kinds of helpful traits like Siphoner. Kayle was another one of the most dominating champions in 4.5 and represented a major issue of the set in terms of flexibility. She needed specific items and specific traits to do well, but when you had them, she did really well. This meant players would try to force her by slamming Kayle items early and praying to find her as a chosen later. Sure, forcing compositions isn't a new concept in Set 4, but it definitely was made easier by rewarding with an instant 2-star unit. But Set 4.5 did also have great aspects as well. Aurelion Sol, for example, utilized the mage trait well, unlike Ahri from the first half of Set 4. Aurelion was all around one of the best designed units of the set. Introducing Xayah and Rakan also helped keepers become relevant. And of course, there was Ornn with his blacksmith trait that added artifacts. Overall, Set 4 had a lot of ups and downs in terms of champion and trait balance within the meta. The first half had a fair amount of flexibility, and all around the amount of splash traits was good for the set. But there were issues in 4.5 with a stale meta and an ever-present problem of 3-star champions being too easy to hit because of the chosen mechanic. And that's going to be it for today's video, folks. Our Set 4 review may have felt a bit harsh at times, but it's necessary to go back and review what made a set do well and not so well. At the end of the day, it's all a learning process, and we've seen how each set the developers get better and better at delivering a fun and satisfying game. Let us know in the comments section below what you felt about Set 4 as a whole. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.